Some grief reshapes you rather than destroys you. I survived losing my only child by discovering that my purpose wasn't gone, just transformed, because Sarah taught me compassion and service that didn't die with her but could flow through me to help others. Grief never disappears, but it changes form, and we honor the dead not with endless suffering, but by letting their love continue through our service, turning our deepest wounds into a source of healing for others. That's how the unsurvivable becomes survivable.
I never believed that cemeteries could be places of peace until the afternoon of March 17, 2024. That was the day I met a woman who would fundamentally alter everything I thought I knew about grief, survival, and the human capacity to find meaning in the unimaginable. What she told me in those quiet hours among the headstones would challenge me, humble me, and ultimately lead me here, to you, sharing a truth so profound yet so quietly spoken that most people walk past it every day without noticing. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I witnessed, what I learned, and what I'm about to share with you. Because the old woman was right about one thing. Some grief does not kill you. It reshapes you. And understanding how that reshaping happens might be the most important lesson any of us ever learn about what it means to be human. This is that story. It was one of those early spring afternoons when the world seems caught between seasons, the air still holding winter's chill but the light suggesting something warmer to come. I had been walking through Riverside Memorial Gardens, not for any particular reason, just moving because staying still in my apartment had become suffocating. My own life, at 42, felt like a series of minor disappointments strung together with moments of distraction. Nothing tragic, nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of dreams deferred and promises unkept. The cemetery was mostly empty, which was why I'd chosen it for my walk. I wasn't looking for company or conversation. I was looking for the kind of solitude that only places of permanent rest can provide. A reminder that whatever small anxieties plagued me were temporary, trivial in the grand scope of things. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, positioned to face a particular section of headstones about 20 feet away. At first glance, she appeared to be just another elderly mourner, someone visiting a departed loved one on an otherwise ordinary Saturday. But something about her stillness caught my attention in a way that made me slow my walking pace and observe more carefully. She was small-framed, probably no more than 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a lavender cardigan over a simple floral dress, sensible walking shoes, and carried a cloth handbag in her lap. Her posture was remarkable, back straight, shoulders squared, chin level. Not the posture of someone weighted down by sorrow, but the bearing of someone who had learned to carry something heavy with dignity. But what truly arrested my attention was the photograph she held in her weathered hands. It was small, perhaps 4 by 6 inches, and she wasn't looking at it with the desperate intensity of fresh grief. Instead, she would glance at it periodically, almost conversationally, as if the image were a companion sharing the bench with her rather than a memorial to someone gone. I'm what you might call an accidental collector of human stories. It's not something I set out to do. I work in municipal planning, of all unglamorous professions, but I've always been drawn to moments that reveal something essential about how people navigate this strange business of being alive. And this elderly woman, sitting with such composed tranquility in a cemetery, was clearly navigating something profound. I found myself slowing to a stop near a magnolia tree about 30 feet from her bench, pretending to admire the early buds while actually watching her from my peripheral vision. She sat for perhaps 10 more minutes, occasionally looking at the photograph, sometimes closing her eyes and tilting her face toward the weak spring sun, other times simply gazing at the headstone before her with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It was something more complex, acceptance mixed with something else I couldn't name. Eventually, she rose from the bench with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints require gentle negotiation. She walked slowly to the headstone, knelt with difficulty but determination, and placed a small bouquet of daffodils at its base. The flowers looked fresh, recently purchased. As she knelt there, I saw her lips moving, though I was too far away to hear any words. It wasn't the desperate one-sided conversation of someone unable to let go, but rather the calm communication of someone maintaining a connection across an impossible distance. When she stood and turned back toward the path, she noticed me for the first time. Our eyes met, and instead of the irritation or embarrassment one might expect at being observed in a private moment, she smiled. It was a small, knowing smile, as if she understood exactly what I'd been doing and found it neither intrusive nor surprising. "Beautiful tree, isn't it?" she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between us. She meant the magnolia I'd been pretending to admire. I felt my face flush with embarrassment at being caught in my observation. "Yes, it is," I managed. "I was just appreciating the early blooms." She walked slowly toward me, and I noticed she moved with the particular care of someone who has learned to work with an aging body rather than against it. As she drew closer, I could see her face more clearly, deeply lined, yes, but her eyes were remarkably alert and clear, a pale gray that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "You weren't really looking at the tree," she said gently when she reached speaking distance. "You were wondering about the old woman sitting alone in a cemetery on a Saturday afternoon." Her directness was disarming. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy." "You didn't intrude on anything," she replied. "Privacy in a public cemetery is an illusion anyway. Besides, I've noticed you here before. You walk these paths often, don't you?" I was surprised she'd noticed me. "Sometimes. When I need to think. It's quiet here." "Yes," she agreed. "The dead are excellent company for the contemplative. They make no demands, offer no judgments, and they've already learned the secret that the living spend so much energy avoiding." "What secret is that?" She smiled again, this time with something that might have been amusement. "That all of it ends. Every story, every struggle, every triumph and tragedy, all of it concludes eventually. And somehow, that's not nearly as terrifying as we spend our lives believing it will be." There was something in the way she spoke, not with the morbid fascination of someone obsessed with death, but with the calm acceptance of someone who had moved through fear and emerged on the other side, that made me want to know more. "May I ask who you were visiting?" I ventured carefully. She looked at me for a long moment, as if assessing whether I was genuinely curious or merely being polite. Whatever she saw in my expression seemed to satisfy her. "My daughter," she said simply. "Sarah. She would have been 53 this month. She was my only child." The past tense landed heavily. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, and I could tell she meant it, that these weren't just automatic words but genuine acknowledgement. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "When I told you Sarah was my only child and used the past tense, what did you assume? That I was here drowning in grief? That visiting her grave was the sad routine of a broken mother who couldn't move forward?" I hesitated because she'd accurately described exactly what I'd thought. "I suppose I assumed this must be very difficult for you." "It is difficult," she said, "but perhaps not in the way you imagine. Would you like to know the difference? Between the grief that destroys and the grief that reshapes." I nodded, completely drawn in now. She gestured to a bench along the path, one with a view of both her daughter's grave and the broader cemetery grounds. "Do you have time to sit with an old woman and hear a story? I promise it's not as depressing as you might think. In fact, it might be the most hopeful thing you hear all year, though it begins in the darkest place imaginable." I had nowhere else to be, nothing else pulling at my attention that mattered more than this unexpected moment. "I have time." We walked slowly to the bench and settled onto it. The old woman arranged her handbag on her lap and carefully placed the photograph she'd been holding inside it. Then she folded her hands, took a slow breath, and began. "My name is Dorothy Fletcher," she said. "I'm 81 years old. I've been a widow for 32 years, and I've been a mother without a living child for 17 years. And I'm going to tell you how I survived the loss that I was certain would kill me, and why I'm grateful every single day that it didn't." She paused, looking out over the cemetery. "But to understand how I survived, you need to understand who I was before. Because the woman sitting here with you now, she's not the same person who buried her only child. She couldn't be. That woman died too, in a way. What remained was to learn to become someone new. Dorothy settled more comfortably on the bench, her gaze distant as she reached back across the decades. I was born in 1943, right in the middle of World War II, she began. My father was overseas when I was born. He wouldn't meet me until I was almost 2 years old. My mother worked in a munitions factory, and I spent my earliest years being raised by my grandmother in a small town in Pennsylvania. I tell you this because I want you to understand that my generation, we learned early that life was uncertain, that security was temporary, that the people you loved could disappear without warning. She glanced at me to make sure I was following. But we also learned resilience. We learned to make do, to find joy in small things, to build lives even when the world was falling apart around us. That resilience, I'd rely on it decades later in ways I never could have imagined. Dorothy's expression softened with memory. I met Robert Fletcher when I was 19 years old. He was 22, just back from Korea, working at the steel mill. We married in 1963, and for a while, life felt like it was finally settling into the peace and prosperity everyone had been promising us. Robert worked steadily, we bought a little house in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, and we started trying for a family. She paused, and I could see something shift in her expression. It took us 8 years to have Sarah. 8 years of hoping and disappointment, of medical appointments and well-meaning but painful advice from people who didn't understand. By the time I got pregnant at 28, I'd almost given up hoping. And when Sarah was born in 1971, healthy and perfect and mine, I thought I'd been given the greatest gift life could offer. Dorothy pulled a handkerchief from her handbag and dabbed at her eyes, though no tears had fallen. I need you to understand something about the kind of mother I became. I didn't just love Sarah. I organized my entire existence around her. Every decision, every priority, every dream I had, all of it centered on her well-being, her happiness, her future. She looked at me directly. You're probably thinking that sounds like good mothering. And it was in many ways. But it was also dangerous, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Because when you make one person, even your own child, your entire reason for existing, you build a structure that's catastrophically unstable. One loss, and the whole thing collapses. I could see where this was heading, but I said nothing, letting her tell the story her way. Robert died when Sarah was 15, Dorothy continued. Heart attack. He was only 42. Sudden, massive, unsurvivable. He left for work one morning and never came home. And just like that, I was a widow with a teenage daughter and no idea how to be anything other than Robert's wife and Sarah's mother. She shook her head slowly. The grief was enormous. But I had Sarah, you see. I had a reason to get up every morning, someone who needed me, someone who gave my life structure and purpose. I threw myself even more completely into motherhood. Sarah became not just my daughter but my entire world, my companion, my purpose, my reason for breathing. Dorothy's voice grew quieter. Sarah was an exceptional young woman. Not because she was mine, though of course I was biased, but objectively exceptional. She was kind without being weak, intelligent without being arrogant, ambitious but not at the expense of others. She wanted to be a doctor, a pediatrician specifically. She said she wanted to help children the way the doctors had helped her when she was sick as a little girl. She made it, Dorothy said with evident pride. Full scholarship to Penn State, then medical school at the University of Pittsburgh. I was so proud I thought my heart might burst. I worked 2 jobs to help with her expenses, sent care packages every week, called her every Sunday evening at exactly 7 o'clock. That Sunday call, it became the backbone of my week. Everything else in my life was just the time between those calls. She paused, staring at her folded hands. Sarah graduated medical school, completed her residency, and established a practice in Philadelphia. She was 31 years old, brilliant, compassionate, successful in every way that mattered. She'd just gotten engaged to a wonderful man named Michael. They were planning a fall wedding. Dorothy's voice remained steady, but I could hear the effort it took. And then, one Tuesday afternoon in April 2007, I got a phone call that every parent fears. There had been an accident. Sarah was driving home from the hospital after a double shift. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the median. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. She closed her eyes briefly. Sarah died before the ambulance arrived. They told me she didn't suffer, though I don't know if that's true or just something they say to comfort the living. Michael called me from the hospital, could barely speak through his sobbing. And I remember thinking with perfect clarity, this is how my life ends. Not physically, perhaps, but in every way that matters. The cemetery was very quiet around us. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The funeral was a blur, Dorothy said. I remember the church was packed. Sarah had touched so many lives. Her patients' families, colleagues, friends from every stage of her life. The service was beautiful, people said, though I barely registered any of it. I sat in the front pew in my black dress, and I felt like I was watching everything from very far away, like I was already gone myself. She took a slow breath. You know what the hardest part was? Not the funeral. Not the immediate shock. The hardest part was the Tuesday after, when 7 o'clock came and the phone didn't ring. And the Tuesday after that. And the one after that. Every Tuesday at 7, for months, I would find myself waiting for a call I knew would never come. Dorothy's voice was barely above a whisper now. I went through the motions of living for a long time. I got up, I showered, I ate enough to survive, I paid my bills. But I wasn't alive. I was just existing. Waiting really. Waiting to die so I could be with Sarah again. I was 64 years old, and I had no reason to continue. She looked at me with those clear gray eyes. Friends tried to help. They'd invite me to dinner, to church, to book clubs. They'd say things like, time heals all wounds and she's in a better place, and you need to move on. Every single platitude made me want to scream. Because time wasn't healing anything. It was just creating more distance between me and the last moment Sarah was alive. She wasn't in a better place. She was dead, and no place is better than being alive. And move on? Move on to what? My entire purpose for existing was gone. Dorothy paused, reaching into her handbag. She pulled out the photograph I'd seen her holding earlier and showed it to me. It was a picture of a young woman in a white coat, stethoscope around her neck, smiling at the camera with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She radiated intelligence and kindness. This is Sarah, Dorothy said softly. Taken a month before she died. She'd just been named attending physician at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She was so happy. I looked at the photograph, at this woman I'd never met but who had shaped the elderly lady sitting beside me in ways I was just beginning to understand. I kept that photograph on my kitchen table for years, Dorothy said. I'd eat breakfast looking at it, talk to it like Sarah was sitting across from me. People would visit and look at me with such pity, such concern. They thought I was losing my mind, maybe I was. All I knew was that photograph was the only thing that felt real. She carefully returned the photo to her handbag. This went on for 3 years. 3 years of just enduring. Not living, just enduring. Getting through each day with no purpose except to reach the next day. I thought about dying constantly. Not suicide, exactly, but just the hope that I might go to sleep and not wake up. That some merciful illness might take me quickly. Dorothy looked out over the cemetery. And then something happened that I didn't expect, that I wasn't prepared for, that changed everything. It was so small, so seemingly insignificant, that I almost missed it entirely. She turned back to me. Do you believe in moments that choose us, rather than us choosing them? Moments when life intervenes and says, not yet. There's something you still need to understand? I wasn't sure how to answer, so I just nodded for her to continue. I was at the grocery store, Dorothy said. 3 years and 2 months after Sarah died. I was in the frozen food aisle, staring at the dinners for one, trying to remember if I'd already eaten that week or if I'd just thought about eating. And I heard this sound, a child crying. Not a tantrum cry, but the hopeless sobbing of a child who is truly distressed. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes brightening with the memory. I turned and saw a little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting on the floor near the dairy section. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe, and there was no adult in sight. Other shoppers were walking past, glancing at her but not stopping. We live in a world now where people are afraid to help a crying child for fear of being accused of something terrible. Dorothy's expression grew fierce. But I wasn't afraid. I'd been a mother. I'd comforted countless tears. And this child needed help. So I approached her slowly, knelt down. It hurt my knees, but I managed, and I said, "Sweetheart, what's wrong? Are you lost?" She smiled at the memory. The little girl looked up at me with these enormous blue eyes, tears streaming down her face, and she nodded. "I can't find my mommy," she sobbed. "She was right here and now she's gone and I don't know where she is." And something in the way she said it, the absolute terror in her voice at being separated from her mother, it broke something open in me. Dorothy's voice grew stronger. I said, "It's okay. We'll find her. Your mommy is probably looking for you right now. Let's go to the front of the store where she can see us better." I held out my hand and this little girl, this stranger's child, took it without hesitation. She trusted me, even though I was just an old woman she'd never seen before. We walked to the customer service counter. Dorothy continued. I explained the situation, they made an announcement, and within 60 seconds a frantic woman came running from the produce section, calling Emma. Emma. The little girl ran to her mother, and they collapsed into each other, both crying now. Dorothy paused, her expression showing both pain and something else, recognition, perhaps. The mother turned to thank me, and I saw in her face the same terror I'd lived with since Sarah died. The terror of losing your child, even briefly. The awareness of how fragile it all is, how quickly the person you love most can simply disappear. She took a slow breath. And the little girl, Emma, she looked back at me and said, "Thank you for staying with me. I was so scared, but you made me not scared anymore." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears for the first time since we'd started talking. And in that moment, I understood something I'd been too consumed by my own grief to see. Sarah was gone. Nothing would ever change that. But that little girl had needed help, had needed comfort, had needed exactly what I'd spent 31 years learning to give as a mother. And I'd been able to help her, to make her fear a little less, to reunite her with her mother. She wiped her eyes with the handkerchief. I walked out of that grocery store, without buying anything I realized later, and I sat in my car and I cried harder than I'd cried since the funeral. But it was different crying. It wasn't the hopeless grief of the past 3 years. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or possibility. Dorothy looked at me intently. Because I realized something crucial. My purpose hadn't died with Sarah. My capacity to comfort, to help, to use everything I'd learned as a mother, that was still alive. Still useful. Still needed by a world full of scared children and grieving parents and people who were lost in their own ways. She settled back against the bench. That was the turning point. Not a sudden transformation. Those don't really exist in real grief. But the beginning of understanding that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding new purpose, new ways to take everything Sarah had taught me about love and turn it into something that honored her memory by helping others. I felt something shifting in my understanding of Dorothy's story, realizing we were moving from tragedy towards something else entirely. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. Dorothy smiled, and it was the first truly joyful expression I'd seen on her face. I started volunteering. First at a local elementary school, reading to children. Then at the children's hospital where Sarah had done some of her training. I'd sit with sick children whose parents couldn't always be there, read them stories, hold their hands during scary procedures, just be present. Her voice grew stronger. And then, about 4 years ago, I started coming here. To the cemetery. Not just to visit Sarah, but to sit in the garden area near the children's section. Because I noticed something. Parents who had lost children often came alone, especially mothers. They'd sit at these tiny graves and they'd be so utterly isolated in their grief. Dorothy looked out over the cemetery grounds. So I started approaching them. Carefully, respectfully. I'd ask if they wanted company or if they'd prefer solitude. And you'd be surprised how many people, even in the deepest grief, want someone to simply acknowledge their loss. Not to fix it, not to explain it, not to minimize it, just to sit with it. She turned back to me. I tell them about Sarah. I showed them her picture. I share what I've learned, that the grief never disappears but it does change shape. That loving someone who's gone isn't the same as being unable to move forward. That finding a new purpose isn't betraying their memory, it's honoring it. I felt tears forming in my own eyes, understanding now what I'd witnessed when I first saw Dorothy. She hadn't just survived an unsurvivable loss. She transformed it into service. The woman you saw today, Dorothy said gently, the one sitting calmly on that bench, she's not the woman who existed 17 years ago. That woman, the one whose entire identity was built around being Sarah's mother, died in 2007. What survived was something else. Someone who had to learn to rebuild purpose from grief, to find meaning in the worst loss imaginable. She paused thoughtfully. People sometimes ask me if I'm over Sarah's death. And I tell them that's the wrong question. You don't get over losing a child. You don't get over losing anyone you truly loved. The grief becomes part of you, woven into who you are. But grief and joy can coexist. Pain and purpose can inhabit the same heart. Dorothy reached into her handbag and pulled out a small notebook, worn from handling. Sarah kept journals. I found 17 of them when I cleaned out her apartment. And in one of them, from when she was in medical school, she wrote something that I read every single day for 5 years until I finally understood it. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a ribbon and read, "Mom called tonight, stressed about money, about me being so far away, about whether she's doing enough. I wish I could make her understand. She's already done everything that mattered. She taught me to be kind, to notice suffering, to help when I can. Everything good I do as a doctor, every child I comfort, every parent I reassure, that's her gift working through me. She thinks her purpose is taking care of me, but really, her purpose was teaching me how to take care of others. That gift doesn't end when I leave home. It multiplies." Dorothy closed the notebook carefully, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't understand what Sarah meant when I first read it. I was too deep in grief, too convinced that my only purpose had been stolen. But now I understand. Sarah was telling me that everything I gave her, the love, the care, the teaching about compassion and service, didn't die with her. It lived on in every life she touched as a doctor, and it can live on in every life I touch now. She looked at me with those clear gray eyes. That's how I survived. Not by forgetting Sarah or moving on, or any of those useless phrases people use. I survived by understanding that love doesn't end with death. It transforms. And if I honor Sarah's memory not with endless grief but with continued service, continued compassion, continued presence for others who are suffering, then she isn't really gone. She's alive in every child I comfort, every parent I sit with, every person I help feel less alone. Dorothy stood slowly from the bench, and I stood with her. "I should be heading home soon," she said. "But I want to leave you with something, since you've been kind enough to listen to an old woman's story." "Please," I said. "I'm grateful you shared it." "Grief," Dorothy said carefully, "is not the enemy. Grief is proof of love. The depth of your grief measures the depth of your love, and there's something beautiful about that, even when it's agonizing. The enemy is despair, the belief that because someone is gone, love itself is gone. Because your purpose ended, no new purpose can emerge." She adjusted her handbag on her shoulder. "I lost my only child. That fact will never change, and it will hurt until the day I die. But I gained something too, though it took years to recognize it. I gained absolute clarity about what matters. I gained freedom from fear. What else can happen to me that's worse than what I've already survived? I gained the ability to sit with other people's pain without flinching, because I know that pain intimately." Dorothy smiled. "And most importantly, I gained the understanding that a life can be rebuilt. Not restored, you can't restore what's been destroyed. But rebuilt, differently, with new purpose and new meaning. The woman I am now, she's stronger than the woman I was before, even though she's also more broken. Both things are true." She extended her hand, and I shook it, feeling the paper-thin skin and fragile bones of her 81 years. "Thank you for listening," she said. "I don't often tell the whole story. But you seemed like you needed to hear it, and I've learned to trust those instincts." I did need to hear it, I admitted, though I'm not sure I understood why until just now. Dorothy nodded knowingly. We rarely understand what we need until we receive it. That's one of life's small mercies. She turned to walk toward the cemetery exit, then paused and looked back. I'll be here next Saturday, same time, if you ever want to talk about whatever it is you're carrying. I'm a very good listener. With that, she walked slowly down the path, her posture still straight despite her age, her steps careful but purposeful. I watched her until she disappeared around a curve in the path, then I sat back down on the bench, my mind reeling from everything I'd heard. I thought about Dorothy's journey from the woman who organized her entire existence around one person to the woman who had learned to find purpose in serving many. I thought about the 3 years she'd spent just enduring, and the small moment in a grocery store that had cracked open a door to transformation. I thought about Sarah's journal entry and the wisdom in understanding that the gifts we give others don't die with them, they multiply. And I thought about my own life, my own minor disappointments and vague dissatisfactions. How small they seemed in comparison to Dorothy's loss. But also how Dorothy would probably tell me that pain isn't comparative, that everyone's suffering is real to them, that the work is learning how to transform whatever we're carrying into something that serves life rather than diminishes it. I sat on that bench for another hour, watching the spring light shift across the headstones, thinking about grief and purpose and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people. Then I walked slowly home, feeling like I'd been given something precious, not answers, exactly, but a different way of thinking about the questions. The following Saturday, I returned to Riverside Memorial Gardens at the same time. Dorothy was already there, sitting on her usual bench with her handbag in her lap and that photograph nearby. When she saw me approaching, she smiled and patted the bench beside her. "I wondered if you'd come," she said. "I couldn't stay away," I admitted. "I've been thinking about what you said all week." "Good," Dorothy said simply. "Stories are meant to be lived with, not just heard." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching other mourners move through the cemetery, some crying, some just standing still, some tending to graves with flowers or small mementos. "Do you see them?" Dorothy asked quietly, gesturing to the various visitors. Each one carrying their own impossible weight. Loss of parents, siblings, friends, children, spouses. Each one convinced their grief is unbearable. And they're right, it is unbearable. Until somehow they bear it anyway. "How many of them do you talk to?" I asked. "Not as many as I'd like," Dorothy said. "Most people want to be alone with their grief, especially early on. I respect that. But some, you can see it in their posture, in the way they look around like they're drowning and hoping someone will notice. Those people I approach. Usually I just sit nearby, close enough that they know I'm available if they need to talk, far enough that I'm not intruding. You'd be surprised how often they start the conversation." "What do you say to them?" Dorothy smiled. "Usually, I don't say much. I listen. I let them tell me about who they lost, what they were like, what they meant. People need to speak the names of the dead, to keep them alive in language even when they're gone from the world. I give them that space." She paused. "And sometimes, if they ask how I cope, how I keep going, I tell them about Sarah. I show them that 17 years later, I'm still here, still visiting, still grieving, but also still living. Still finding meaning. Still able to laugh and help others and experience joy. That gives them something, evidence that survival is possible, even when it seems impossible." I thought about that, the gift of evidence, of proof that the can somehow be survived. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said. "Of course. Do you ever resent it? Having to be strong for other people, having to be the example of resilience, when maybe some days you just want to fall apart yourself?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, and I worried I'd overstepped. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than offended. "That's a good question," she said. "And the answer is yes, sometimes. There are days when I come here and I just want to sit with my daughter and rage at the universe for taking her. Days when I want someone else to be strong while I crumble. Days when the weight of being inspirational Dorothy who survived tragedy feels like another burden on top of the actual grief." She turned to look at me. But here's what I've learned: strength isn't constant. It's not something you achieve and then possess forever. It's something you practice, and some days the practice feels impossible, and that's okay. On those days, I let myself feel whatever I'm feeling. I cry if I need to cry. I stay home if I need to stay home. I don't always have to be the wise old woman who's transformed her grief into service. Dorothy smiled slightly. But most days I find that helping others actually helps me. It sounds contradictory, but it's true. When I sit with a newly grieving mother and I see in her eyes the same devastation I felt 17 years ago, I'm able to offer her even a small amount of comfort or hope that gives me purpose. It reminds me why I'm still here. It transforms my pain into something useful. That's remarkable, I said quietly. It's human, Dorothy corrected gently. We're meaning-making creatures. We survive horrors by finding purpose in them, by extracting wisdom from suffering, by turning our deepest wounds into sources of compassion for others. That's not remarkable. That's just what humans do when we choose life over despair. We sat together for a while longer, and Dorothy told me more stories. About the different people she'd met in the cemetery over the years. About Maria, who'd lost infant twins and who Dorothy had sat with every week for 6 months until Maria felt strong enough to return to work. About James, who'd lost his teenage son to suicide and who met regularly with Dorothy at a coffee shop to talk about guilt and grief and the impossible question of how to forgive yourself for what you couldn't prevent. I've become part of an invisible network, Dorothy explained. People who've survived terrible losses and who've committed themselves to helping others survive theirs. We don't advertise it. We don't have official meetings. But we recognize each other. In hospital waiting rooms, in support groups, in quiet corners of cemeteries. And we do what we can. As the afternoon light began to fade, Dorothy prepared to leave. But before she stood, she pulled something else from her handbag, a small card with an address and phone number written in careful handwriting. "This is the grief support group I help facilitate," she said, handing me the card. "It meets Tuesday evenings at the community center. You don't have to have lost someone to attend. Sometimes people come because they're caring for someone who's dying, or because they're struggling with other kinds of loss. Job loss, divorce, loss of identity. Grief takes many forms." "Thank you," I said, taking the card. I might actually come." Dorothy's smile was warm. "We'd be glad to have you. And even if you don't, even if we never see each other again after today, I want you to remember something." "What's that?" "Whatever you're carrying, and I can see you're carrying something even if you haven't named it yet, it doesn't have to destroy you. It can reshape you instead. The question isn't whether you'll be changed by difficulty and loss. You will be. Everyone is. The question is whether you'll let that change make you bitter or make you deeper. Smaller or more expansive. More afraid or more compassionate." She stood slowly, gathering her handbag. I chose to be reshaped rather than destroyed. It wasn't easy. It took years. It required help and time and more tears than I thought a human body could produce. But I'm still here. Still finding reasons to get up in the morning. Still able to love life even though life took what I loved most. Dorothy touched my shoulder briefly, a gesture of benediction. "You'll find your way through whatever you're facing. I can see it in you, the strength you don't know you have yet. Trust it. And when you're ready, use it to help someone else find their way. That's how we survive the unsurvivable. Not alone, but together." She walked away then, and I remained on the bench as darkness began to settle over the cemetery. I thought about everything Dorothy had shared, the depth of her loss, the years of just enduring, the small moment that had opened a door to transformation, the choice to turn grief into service. And I thought about my own life, my own losses that I'd been so consumed by. The career that hadn't materialized the way I'd hoped. The relationship that had ended badly. The general sense of having somehow missed the life I was supposed to have. How self-indulgent those preoccupations seemed now. But Dorothy would probably tell me, and I could almost hear her voice, that all pain is real, all disappointment matters, and that the work is always the same. Find the purpose hiding in the pain, find the service you can offer from your suffering. Over the following months, I did attend Dorothy's grief support group. Not every week. Some weeks the vulnerability felt like too much, but often enough to become a familiar face. I met the network Dorothy had described, people who'd survived the unsurvivable and who'd committed themselves to helping others do the same. I heard stories that made Dorothy's seem almost bearable in comparison. A man who'd lost his entire family in a house fire. A woman who'd buried 3 children to genetic disease. A father whose son had murdered someone and was serving life in prison. A different kind of loss, he explained, because his child was alive but utterly gone from his life. Each person carried something that should have destroyed them, and yet they were all there week after week, helping newcomers understand that survival was possible. And Dorothy was the steady center of it all. Not leading in any formal sense. The group was peer-led, everyone's voice equal, but providing a kind of gravitational force. When someone was drowning in fresh grief, Dorothy could sit with them in that darkness without flinching. When someone was tentatively emerging into rebuilding, Dorothy celebrated their small victories like they were monumental achievements. I learned that Dorothy volunteered not just at the cemetery and the support group, but at the children's hospital 3 days a week, at a hospice 1 day a week, and at a crisis hotline from home when she had energy. At 81 years old, she had built a life so full of service that it was hard to believe she'd spent years convinced her purpose had died with Sarah. One evening after the group, I walked Dorothy to her car. She still drove, carefully but competently, and I asked her something I'd been wondering about. Do you think Sarah would be proud of who you've become? Of what you've built from losing her? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on the car door. I think Sarah would be surprised, she said finally. The mother she knew was so focused on her, so organized around making sure Sarah had everything she needed. That woman was loving but also anxious, always worried about whether she was doing enough. She smiled softly. The woman I am now, I think Sarah would be proud of her. Because I finally learned what Sarah tried to tell me in that journal entry, that the point of loving someone isn't to make them your entire world. It's to let them teach you how to love the whole world. Sarah taught me compassion, patience, how to sit with suffering without trying to fix it. She didn't teach me those things so I could only use them on her. She taught me so I could offer them to everyone who needs them. Dorothy opened her car door, then paused. I'll tell you a secret. Sometimes, when I'm sitting with someone in terrible grief, helping them understand that survival is possible, I feel Sarah with me. Not literally, I'm not claiming mystical experiences. But I feel the continuity. I feel how the love I gave her is flowing through me to help someone else. And in those moments, she's not gone. She's present in the most important way, in the good her life taught me to do. She got into her car, and I closed the door gently. Through the window, she said, that's how we survive losing the people we love most. We let their love continue through us. We become the carriers of their best qualities. We make our lives into living memorials, not monuments of grief but monuments of continued love and service. Dorothy drove away, and I stood in the parking lot thinking about living memorials, about love that continues through service, about the extraordinary resilience of an 81-year-old woman who had every reason to give up but instead chose to become a source of hope for others. I continued attending the support group for almost a year. Eventually, I began to share my own story, not of dramatic loss like the others, but of the smaller griefs that had been weighing on me. The dreams that hadn't materialized. The loneliness I'd been carrying. The sense of purposelessness that had been my constant companion. And the group, these people who'd survived the unsurvivable, they listened with the same compassionate attention they gave everyone. They didn't minimize my pain by comparing it to theirs. They simply acknowledged it, made space for it, and gently suggested that the same principles that had helped them might help me. Find the purpose hiding in the pain, find the service you can offer, let difficulty reshape you into something deeper rather than something bitter. I started volunteering at a literacy program, teaching adults to read. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't life-saving, but it was useful. It gave me purpose outside myself. It connected me to people whose struggles made mine seem manageable. It taught me what Dorothy had been trying to show me all along, that meaning doesn't come from getting what you want, but from giving what you can. The last time I saw Dorothy was almost 18 months after our first meeting. I'd returned to Riverside Memorial Gardens, wanting to thank her properly for the gift she'd given me. I found her on the same bench, in the same posture of peaceful contemplation, the photograph of Sarah nearby. When I approached, she smiled with genuine warmth. "I was hoping you'd come back," she said. "I've been following your progress through the group. You're doing well." "Because of you," I said. "Because of what you taught me." Dorothy shook her head gently. "I didn't teach you anything. I just showed you what I'd learned, and you did the work of applying it to your own life. That's all any of us can do, share what we've learned and trust others to make it what they need." We sat together for a while in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon light shift across the cemetery. Then Dorothy said something that I've carried with me ever since. "You know what the real secret is? The thing that took me the longest to understand." "What's that?" "The people we've lost, they don't want us to suffer endlessly. They want us to live. Every parent wants their child to thrive. Every child wants their parents to find peace. Every person who loved us would want us to find joy again, to build meaningful lives, to honor their memory not with eternal grief but with continued love and service." Dorothy looked at Sarah's headstone with such tenderness. "Sarah didn't spend her life becoming a doctor so that when she died, I'd spend the rest of my life paralyzed by grief. She became a doctor to help people, to reduce suffering, to make the world a little better. And if I let her death stop me from doing the same thing in my own way, that would be the real tragedy. That would be letting her death kill two people instead of one." She turned back to me. "So I choose to live. Not despite losing Sarah, but in some strange way because of losing her. Because having loved her so completely and lost her so suddenly taught me that life is precious and brief and absolutely worth living fully, right up until the last possible moment." Dorothy stood, preparing to leave. "I need to get going. I'm reading to children at the hospital in an hour. But I want to leave you with one more thing. Please, stop waiting for your real life to begin. Stop thinking that once you achieve certain things or fix certain problems or become a certain kind of person, then you'll finally start living. This is it. This moment, right now, exactly as you are, this is your real life. The only question is whether you'll live it fully or spend it waiting for something better." She touched my shoulder the way she had that first day. "You have everything you need to live meaningfully right now. The capacity to help others. The ability to connect. The opportunity to serve. Don't waste years waiting for perfect circumstances before you start. Perfect circumstances never come. You have to make meaning with what you've got, right where you are." With that, Dorothy walked away toward the cemetery exit, her posture still straight, her steps still purposeful despite her 81 years. And I understood that I was watching someone who had truly mastered the art of living, not by avoiding pain or loss, but by transforming them into sources of wisdom and compassion. I never saw Dorothy Fletcher again after that day. Not in person, anyway. But about 6 months later, I received an email from one of the support group members with sad news. Dorothy had died peacefully in her sleep at age 82. There would be a memorial service, and everyone was invited. I attended the memorial, held at the community center where Dorothy had facilitated the grief support group. The room was packed, easily 200 people, maybe more. Parents who'd lost children and whom Dorothy had comforted. Sick children from the hospital who'd recovered and wanted to honor the kind old lady who'd read to them during treatment. Volunteers from the hospice. Members of the support group. Crisis hotline colleagues. People from every corner of Dorothy's extensive network of service. One by one, people stood and shared what Dorothy had meant to them. Every story followed the same pattern. I was drowning in grief/fear/despair, and Dorothy sat with me. She didn't fix it, but she showed me that survival was possible. She helped me transform my pain into purpose. Near the end of the service, the officiant announced that Dorothy had left specific instructions for her memorial. She'd written them years earlier, apparently, just after she'd started volunteering at the cemetery. The officiant read from Dorothy's letter. "If you're at my memorial service, it means I've finally joined Sarah. I hope I used my time well in the 17 years, or however long it turned out to be, between losing her and losing myself. My request is simple: don't grieve for me the way I once grieved for Sarah, with paralysis and despair. Instead, take whatever you learned from knowing me and use it to help someone else. That's how we honor the dead, by letting their lives continue through our actions. Find someone who's drowning and sit with them. Find someone who's lost and help them navigate. Find someone who's convinced life is over and show them, through your example, that rebuilding is possible. That's my legacy. Not sadness, but service. Not endless grief, but continued love flowing outward to whoever needs it. The letter concluded, I'm being buried next to Sarah. We'll finally be together again, and that brings me peace. But I hope you'll remember, I didn't spend 17 years waiting to die so I could be with her. I spent 17 years living as fully as I could, serving as deeply as possible, loving as expansively as I was able. That's what she would have wanted. That's what all of our loved ones would want. So please, live. Fully, courageously, generously. That's the only memorial any of us really need. The service ended, and I walked out into the spring sunshine, almost exactly 2 years after the day I'd first met Dorothy in the cemetery. I felt grief at her loss, but also profound gratitude. She'd given me something irreplaceable, evidence that the unsurvivable can be survived, that purpose can be rebuilt from devastation, that a life can be reshaped into something meaningful even after the worst loss imaginable. I returned to Riverside Memorial Gardens one last time, a few weeks after Dorothy's burial. I found her grave easily, right next to Sarah's, just as she'd wanted. Someone had already placed flowers there, and I added my own small bouquet to the collection. I stood there for a long time, thinking about the 81-year-old woman I'd met on a bench 2 years earlier. Thinking about how she'd looked that day, composed, peaceful, still wearing her grief but not consumed by it. Thinking about her steady choice to transform devastation into service, to let her daughter's death reshape her rather than destroy her. And I thought about what she taught me, that we survive the unsurvivable not by forgetting or moving on, but by finding a new purpose. That grief and joy can coexist in the same heart. That the people we've lost live on through the love we continue to give to others. That rebuilding is always possible, even when it seems impossible. As I turned to leave the cemetery, I noticed a woman sitting on the bench where I'd first seen Dorothy. The same bench, the same posture of quiet contemplation. She was younger than Dorothy had been, maybe in her 60s, and she was holding a photograph and crying softly. I hesitated. This wasn't my place. I wasn't Dorothy. I didn't have her decades of hard-won wisdom or her extraordinary capacity for sitting with others' pain. But then I remembered Dorothy's last words to me. You have everything you need to live meaningfully right now. The capacity to help others. The ability to connect. The opportunity to serve. I walked slowly toward the bench. When I was close enough to speak without startling her, I said gently, I don't mean to intrude, but I noticed you sitting here, and I wondered if you'd like some company, or if you'd prefer to be alone. Either is perfectly fine. The woman looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, surprised but not hostile. I think I'd like company, she said quietly. If you don't mind. I sat down beside her on the bench, and she told me about her son. About the accident. About how it had only been 3 months and she didn't know how to keep breathing, didn't know how to survive this, didn't know if she even wanted to. And I listened. I didn't try to fix her pain or minimize it or offer platitudes. I just listened the way Dorothy had taught me. And then, carefully, I told her about Dorothy. About a woman who'd lost her only child and spent years convinced she couldn't survive, but who eventually learned to reshape her grief into service. About how she'd sat on this very bench, offering comfort to newly grieving parents, showing them through her presence that survival was possible. Did it get easier for her? The woman asked through her tears. Not easier, I said honestly, remembering Dorothy's words. But different. The grief never disappeared, but she learned to carry it. And she learned that even while carrying that grief, she could still help others. Still find purpose. Still build a meaningful life. We sat together for another hour, and I shared what little wisdom I'd learned from Dorothy. That grief is proof of love. That rebuilding is possible. That the unsurvivable can somehow be survived, one day at a time, with help and time and the choice to let pain reshape you rather than destroy you. When the woman finally stood to leave, she said, "Thank you." I don't know if I believe yet that I can survive this, but it helps to know that someone else did. That she made it 17 years and was still able to help others. Maybe eventually I can do the same. Maybe you can, I agreed. And when you're ready, when you've found your footing again, maybe you'll sit on this bench and offer the same comfort to someone else who's drowning. That's how we honor the people we've lost. By letting their love continue through us. The woman nodded, wiped her eyes, and walked slowly toward the parking lot. And I sat there on Dorothy's bench, feeling the weight and the gift of what I'd just done. I'd offered comfort to someone in devastation. I'd shared Dorothy's wisdom, passing it forward to someone who needed it. I'd become part of the invisible network she'd described, people who've survived terrible things and who've committed themselves to helping others survive theirs. I understood then what Dorothy had been trying to teach me all along. This was the secret to surviving the unsurvivable. You take what you've learned from your pain and you use it to ease someone else's pain. You let your wounds become sources of wisdom. You transform your suffering into service. You become living proof that rebuilding is possible, that life can continue even after devastating loss, that purpose can emerge from devastation. That's how Dorothy survived burying her only child. That's how she built a meaningful life for 17 years after a loss that should have destroyed her. That's how she helped hundreds of other people navigate their own unsurvivable losses. And now, sitting on her bench in the cemetery where she'd spent so many hours offering comfort to strangers, I understood that her legacy wasn't just the people she'd directly helped. It was the ripple effect, everyone she'd helped who would go on to help others, who would pass forward the wisdom she'd shared, who would become their own sources of comfort and hope for people drowning in fresh grief. Dorothy Fletcher died at 82, 17 years after losing her only child. But her gift, the understanding that we survive the unsurvivable by transforming grief into service, that gift continues. In every person she touched who now touches others. In every moment of comfort offered by someone who learned from her example. In every choice to reshape rather than be destroyed. That's the real answer to the question of how you survive burying your only child. You survive by choosing, every single day, to let love continue. Not the specific love for that specific person, that relationship is gone, and grieving it is necessary and right. But the capacity to love, to serve, to connect, to help, that can continue, that can grow, that can become your new purpose, your new reason to keep breathing, your new way of honoring what you've lost. Dorothy taught me that. And now, whenever I meet someone drowning in loss or disappointment or despair, I try to teach them the same thing. Not because I'm wise or strong, but because Dorothy showed me what's possible when we choose to be reshaped rather than destroyed. The only question that really matters in life, not just after devastating loss, but in every difficult moment, is this: will I let this break me, or will I let it remake me into something deeper, more compassionate, more purposeful than I was before? Dorothy chose to be remade. And in choosing that, again and again for 17 years, she became a source of light for hundreds of people walking through darkness. That's how you survive the unsurvivable. That's how grief becomes grace. That's how loss becomes legacy. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the 11th Hour Tales for more eye-opening tales every day.